the school corridors echoed with laughter and chatter. But for Daniel Carter, they were nothing more than walls closing in on him. He walked through them like a ghost, a boy no one wanted to deal with, a name teachers whispered in frustration. At just 16 years old, Daniel had mastered the art of pushing people away. He wasn't just rebellious, he was angry at the world. Teachers called him a troublemaker, a lost cause, a waste of potential. His classmates either feared him or avoided him altogether. But no one truly knew why Daniel acted the way he did. At home, there was no warmth waiting for him. His father had walked out years ago, disappearing like he never existed. His mother, once full of life, had become a prisoner to her own battles, drowning in addiction. Some nights she didn't come home at all. On others, she barely recognized her own son. Daniel had learned not to expect anything from anyone. Life had taught him one lesson. The world doesn't care about broken people. So he stopped caring too. Skipping classes became routine. Fighting became second nature. Detention was more familiar than a family dinner. Every time a teacher tried to discipline him, he met them with the same cold stare, the same smirk that dared them to believe he could be saved. And yet, deep inside, hidden beneath the walls he had built, was a boy who still ached for something, anything to prove that he mattered. But in a school that had already written him off, Daniel knew better than to hope. He was just waiting for the inevitable, the day they finally gave up and expelled him for good. Most teachers saw Daniel Carter as a problem, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. But Mr. Walter Reid saw something else. He had been teaching for over 30 years, long enough to recognize the look in Daniel's eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was pain disguised as defiance. He had seen students like him before, kids the world had abandoned, kids who had stopped believing in second chances. And he knew one thing for sure: no child was born broken. The first time Daniel walked into his classroom, he didn't sit. He slouched. His uniform was barely buttoned, his books untouched. He didn't bother making eye contact, but the challenge was clear. I dare you to teach me. I dare you to care. Other teachers tried to control him with detentions and threats, but Mr. Reid didn't believe in punishment as a solution. He believed in understanding. So, instead of scolding Daniel for being late, he simply pulled out an empty chair next to his desk and said, "Sit, let's talk." Daniel scoffed. Not interested. Mr. Reid didn't flinch. Then don't talk, just listen. For the first time, someone wasn't yelling at him. Someone wasn't calling him a failure. Daniel didn't admit it, but it threw him off. Days turned into weeks, and while Daniel continued his usual attitude, he noticed one thing. This old man wasn't giving up on him. No matter how rude he was, no matter how much he resisted, Mr. Reid kept showing up, calm, patient, unshaken. It was the first time in Daniel's life that someone looked at him without judgment, but with hope. The day started like any other. Daniel walked into Mr. Reid's class late, dragging his feet, barely acknowledging anyone. He slumped into his seat, waiting for the lecture to begin. But today, Mr. Reid wasn't holding a textbook. He simply wrote on the board, "The moment that changed my life." The students exchanged glances. Some rolled their eyes. Another writing assignment. "This isn't for a grade." Mr. Reid said, his voice calm but firm. "I just want you to write honestly. One moment, one memory that changed you." Daniel stared at the blank page in front of him. His fingers tapped against the desk, restless. "What if we don't have one?" someone mumbled from the back. Mr. Reid smiled. "Everyone has a moment. Even if you think you don't, there's something inside you waiting to be heard." Daniel scoffed. "What's the point? No one cares about my life." Mr. Reid turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Then write, like no one's reading." Daniel let out a short laugh, shaking his head. He shoved the notebook aside, but something about Mr. Reid's words lingered. That night, alone in his room, he picked up the notebook again. He stared at the blank page, fingers gripping the pen, his mind racing. And then, for the first time in years, he wrote. He wrote about his father leaving, about his mother's distant eyes, lost in her own world, about the nights he sat alone, wondering if he mattered to anyone. The words poured out faster than he could think. By the time he looked up, his hands were shaking. The next morning, Daniel walked into class and, without a word, placed the notebook on Mr. Reid's desk. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned and left. Mr. Reid opened the notebook, his eyes scanning the words carefully. His heart clenched. It wasn't just an essay. It was a cry for help. Instead of marking it with corrections, he wrote just one sentence at the bottom. "Your pain has a voice. Don't silence it." The next morning, Daniel walked into class, expecting nothing. He didn't care if Mr. Reid had read what he wrote. It didn't matter. Or at least that's what he told himself. But when he sat down, he noticed something. His notebook was on his desk, neatly closed, as if waiting for him. For a moment he hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he flipped it open. There were no red marks, no corrections, just one simple sentence at the bottom of the page. "Your pain has a voice. Don't silence it." Daniel's fingers traced the words, his chest tightening in a way he didn't understand. No one had ever told him his voice mattered before. The next assignment came, and for the first time, Daniel didn't ignore it. He wrote again. This time it wasn't just pain. It was memories, dreams, fears he never spoke out loud. Day after day, his words filled the pages, and without realizing it, he was writing more than anyone in the class. Mr. Reid noticed. One afternoon, he stopped Daniel after class. "Have you ever thought about writing stories?" Daniel frowned. "Why would I? Who cares what I have to say?" Mr. Reid smiled. "Because words change people. And you, Daniel, you have the kind of words people don't forget." Daniel didn't know what to say. No one had ever believed in him like that. No one had ever looked at him and seen something worth saving. That night, for the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel like fighting the world. Instead, he picked up his notebook and wrote. Not because he had to, but because for the first time he wanted to. And he didn't stop. His words flowed like they had been trapped inside him for years, just waiting for someone to notice. And Mr. Reid did. The old teacher had seen something in Daniel long before he saw it in himself. Something had shifted in Daniel. For the first time, he wasn't just existing. He was creating. He still carried his rough edges, still walked with his usual indifference. But there was a difference. His notebook was always with him, pages filling up faster than he could keep track. Writing had become an escape, a way to make sense of the emotions he had buried for so long. Mr. Reid saw the change before anyone else. Daniel had stopped skipping class. The fire in his eyes wasn't just anger anymore. There was something else, something closer to hope. One day, Mr. Reid handed him a book. "You remind me of this author," he said with a knowing smile. Daniel raised a brow. "I remind you of a guy who writes books? Number, you remind me of someone whose words could change lives, just like his did." Daniel didn't say much, but that night he read the book cover to cover. For the first time, he saw the power of words beyond his own pain. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Daniel started opening up in ways he never had before. His classmates, the same ones who once avoided him, started noticing. Teachers who had written him off began to see something different. And then, one morning, Mr. Reid made an announcement. "There's a writing competition coming up. I think you should enter." Daniel laughed. "Me? No way." Mr. Reid didn't push. He simply placed a blank entry form on his desk. "Think about it." Daniel stared at the paper for a long time. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward something. The day Daniel never thought would come had arrived. Graduation. He sat among his classmates, dressed in the same cap and gown as them. Yet his journey had been anything but the same. He had spent years believing he wouldn't make it this far. He had been certain he would either drop out or be expelled long before this moment. But he wasn't the same person anymore. As names were called one by one, Daniel's hands tightened around the program. He scanned the crowd, searching for the one person who had made this possible. And there he was, Mr. Reid, sitting in the back row, just like always, watching, quiet, proud. Daniel's name was announced, and as he walked across the stage, he didn't hear the applause. He didn't hear the cheers. All he heard was the quiet voice in his mind, the same voice that had once told him he was a failure. But it was gone now. After the ceremony, Daniel found Mr. Reid in the empty hallway, standing by the door as if he had been waiting for him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel swallowed hard and said the words he had never said to anyone before. "You're the only one who ever saw me." Mr. Reid smiled, his eyes kind. "And look at you now." Daniel nodded. He didn't need to say anything else. Mr. Reid already knew. The auditorium was packed. Thousands of people filled the seats, waiting to hear from Daniel Carter, the best-selling author whose words had touched millions. Daniel stood at the podium, staring at the sea of faces before him. He had given many speeches before, but tonight was different. He took a slow breath and began. "There was a time when I thought I was nothing, a time when I believed the world had already decided my worth, and it wasn't much." The room fell silent. I was angry, lost, convinced that no one cared if I existed, and maybe no one did, except for one man. He paused, his voice steady but filled with something deeper, gratitude. He didn't lecture me. He didn't try to fix me. He just saw me. When everyone else saw a lost cause, he saw a boy who still had a chance. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People were leaning in, hanging on to every word. Daniel scanned the audience, his eyes searching for one familiar face. And then, in the very last row, he saw him. Mr. Walter Reid, the old teacher, sat quietly, his eyes glistening, his hands folded in his lap. Daniel swallowed hard. "If Mr. Walter Reid is here tonight, I want to say, 'Sir, you saved my life.'" The crowd erupted into applause. But Daniel wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the man who had believed in him first. This story is a reminder that kindness, patience, and belief in someone can create miracles. Sometimes, all a person needs is one person to see them, truly see them. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring stories.